Hi everyone, welcome to the Untethered Mind. And as always, we have interesting guests, and this is, I think, our third therapist now. And I'm really, really excited to have this chat because she's actually, as of now, our first ex-Muslim therapist on the podcast. And Aisha and I met online actually from her Instagram page, After Faith. Because we don't have a lot of that. We don't have a lot of therapists and a lot of people talking about religious trauma and talking about leaving faith as well and how that impacts your lives as a therapist from a professional point of view. So, Aisha, would you like to kind of introduce yourself and a bit of your personal background, but also your professional background as well?
Yeah, so I've been a therapist for about 11 years now. So I born and raised in England, in the UK, and I trained initially in the NHS, so supporting people with general depression, anxiety problems, and sort of did a bit of management, supervising other therapists. And then in 2020, I decided to, like you've mentioned, launch After Faith, which was my first private practice, which was sort of dedicated to supporting ex-Muslims who needed therapy. And yeah, the reason that I decided to do that was my own journey of, I think I've mentioned I'm a Pakistani, was raised as a Muslim, and I used to identify as Muslim, used to follow Islam, but I left the faith and I kind of came out to my family in, I think it was about 2015, so sort of 5 years till I felt able to sort of provide support to other people. And I guess one of the things I was very conscious of when I was going through my own journey is there was no therapist who kind of really understood. And, here in the UK, I did access a couple of different therapists who I don't think could ever quite comprehend how strongly, it might be the best way to say it, my family felt about things. And kind of, there was a lot of, well, can't you just speak to your parents? And just kind of think, yeah, and I know from other ex-Muslims I work with now that we've sadly all, I think, had these comments where they think it's not that big of a deal. And I think it is really hard to understand it unless you've been through it as well.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot of therapists who are not ex-Muslims, and we usually do like this onboarding training, and sometimes faith-to-faithless will have their apostasy safeguarding training. And I think like you said, there's not a lot of understanding. So that also means that I have a very selective group of therapists that I interview and talk to. Not that I am a therapist and know anything about it, but it's mostly helping them understand, like, this is what you'll be getting into, right? You're not going to talk to somebody who you can just call, 911 or 112 and get that support. There'll be people that absolutely cannot get support in their countries as well, let alone like come out to their parents or the state. And it's always very difficult. And it's also really interesting to hear the therapist's perspective, after they've done a few people, they've done a few sessions. And I'm like, so how did it go? And they're like, this is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Like the way they see things, it's changing their perspective, but it's also like allowing, ex-Muslims to see it from a different perspective as well. Because some people are pretty much like, I want a Western therapist. And then some people who are like, I want a Muslim
Yeah,
therapist, because we have a
yeah,
Muslim
yeah,
therapist as
absolutely.
well.
Yeah.
So actually, what was your experience like when you were going to therapy before you decided to be a therapist for ex-Muslims?
Yeah. So I had a few different few different therapists. I got ghosted by two
Ooh,
therapists.
it is like dating, isn't it?
It's yeah, it was, I and I went, this wasn't NHS, so this was something that I was paying for, which kind of felt more personal as well. But yeah, I remember going for, I think, one appointment with a counsellor who said she would let me know when her next appointment was, and I never heard from her again. I chased her up, I didn't get a response. And I think it's always really hard at being on the receiving end of that, because maybe she was just busy, but then takes 2 minutes to send an email, right? And I think you can't help but wonder, is it because she just fell outside of her depth and she didn't know, which again is fair enough. I think as therapists, we need to acknowledge that I can't work with everything. I don't know everything about everyone's problems, and we all have to work within, what we're comfortable with, what we're competent in as well. But yeah, that felt personal. Like maybe I'd told her these things and she was like, this sounds like too much hard work. Again, these are
But
the assumptions we make, right? But who knows?
that's so strange. I mean, I would be really annoyed if any of my therapists just went like, "Oh, hey, bye." I would at least expect them to go like, "Hey," because I've had that. I've had that situations where therapists have gone like, "I can't work with this person anymore," only because I feel that they need physical help, like they need in-person help.
Yes.
And, this is not something I can support with because X, Y, Z. And they create a plan for it as well. They're like, okay, look, we're going to end our contacts, like, in these sessions. So that's really strange that, anybody would ghost you because, I would be really annoyed as well. And I'm like, what do you mean you're ghosting me? I sound like a stalker.
It's really hard to ask for help as well, because I remember I've been dealing with this on my own, and I was like, there's always this, it's hard to basically say I need help. And I kind of, I remember I went to this woman's house. It was actually in her house. It was well before COVID days. But yeah, there was that. And then I remember I went to the NHS for treatment as well. And I think I had 2 sessions, and it's not funny. It makes me laugh, but it's not funny. But I remember being in tears. This was actually, even though I'd gone through my journey, I was also dating a guy at the time, and that wasn't working out. And I was distraught. And she was like, I think you're doing really well. I was like, look at me. I didn't feel like I was. But I could save you the boring details. The week before I had been doing well, but this week I wasn't. But she was very adamant that because I'd been okay the week before, which that's not how journeys with mental health work, right? Like it's not, you don't consistently have to be down to have a problem. So yeah, she told me I wasn't allowed to come back. So that was also not a great experience for me. And then I finally found a counsellor through my work actually, who offered counselling, and she was much better. There was a lot of, and I think this is a great thing about therapists who haven't been through it, who they actually want to learn. And they will ask questions of, I don't understand your culture, but can you give me an understanding? And they listen. And again, I know that takes time, but I would much rather do that and have someone who can then apply what I've told them to the rest of our work. So it's really important that, whoever I think people do go to see, that they do have that relationship where their therapist is genuinely curious to hear about their situation and their background. Because, we can't expect everyone to know everything. I certainly don't know about everyone's cultures, but it's, I will always be interested to hear about it, to make sure that I can do the best job for them. So yeah, she was great. And I think I had about 8 sessions with her through work, and that got me through the stage I was at that time.
And like you said, it takes a lot to ask for help because our culture is like, mental health, like what? Just recite the dua. What are you talking about? And I do have some therapists who will email me and they're like, can you explain the concept of guilt and shame even after you've left religion? And then I had to kind of go like, okay, look, I see it this way. Like, even after you've left, it carries you. Like sometimes you feel like you're sinning when you're like, oh my God, I've left. Or it's just that shame of letting people down, or shame of, this potential idea of heaven that you've kind of let go as well. That takes years. But so how did you go from like, obviously having your own journey and then, having a therapist who listened and applied, to then going like, okay, I need to create this space for ex-Muslims as well?
It was something one of my ex-Muslim friends actually said to me. She sort of suggested, would you ever, provide therapy for other ex-Muslims? And I think when she said that to me, I hadn't healed basically. And I remember thinking there's no way I wouldn't feel able to do that now. But eventually I got to a place where I did feel able to do that. And I thought, I think it's one of those things where when I was starting out, I thought, is anyone going to come for help? Or was it, and I thought, well, I'll try it. If the need is there, I'll keep doing it. And if it isn't, it was alongside a full-time job. It wasn't my only job by any means. So yeah, I started it in I think 2020, and yeah, I got a few clients come through, and I obviously still do as well. So I kind of just kept going with that. And I think what I liked is when I started that, I was still in a sort of full-time employed job who let me do a lot of training on honour-based abuse, which is something that, again, it's kind of crazy to me that not everyone knows about these terms of honour-based abuse, and we know we have honour-based killings as well. And a lot of people in healthcare here in the UK, at least, still don't understand what that is, or that that's a thing, or parents have killed their adult children here in the UK. Yes, they have. This happens every year. So it's been good to be able to train other therapists to understand, and that's not specific to ex-Muslims. This can be obviously, even people who are still religious, but helping other therapists to understand that, I think, is also something that's really important to me, because I'm really conscious that, again, I'm based in the UK, so a lot of clients here will go via the NHS, and there's a real lack of awareness. Having worked in the NHS for years, it's not something that's taught. So it's not taught to us to look out for these issues. So yeah, it's been good to help sort of be able to spread that message through via other therapists, but of course doing my own work. So I have a mix now. I have some ex-Muslim clients, but I do still do the more general anxiety, depression, trauma is a big part of that as well. So there's kind of loads of different things I do now.
And also, like, when you're training other therapists, it's like almost like you're creating like more people who can support other people.
Yeah.
Right? Like it is like being a teacher, right? Like, you're creating the next generation, or kind of taking them that step ahead with your experience and your knowledge and your understanding. And that also, that abuse is not like, killing is not the only form. It's in so many different levels as well. And also how people hide it and would protect their parents. And, they would do anything. Like, apart from like the mental health program with Faithless Hijabi, I've worked with a lot of cases, even in the UK, where they wouldn't report their parents for abusing them. Like, it's crazy. And I mean, I get it. Like, it was a Somali girl, and I get it. I completely get it. And I had to tell her, like, look, you need to do this. You have younger siblings. And, her older sister, who was an ex-Muslim, would also not do it. And I'm like, your youngest sister is in trouble. She could be killed. And it was just like, oh my God, it was like so many layers. And even just talking to like social services or the police or the embassy, they just couldn't. They couldn't fathom. They're like, oh, she's doing fine. We checked in on her. And I'm like, did you talk to her alone? And they're like, no, we can't do that. She's a minor. And I'm like, And then you wonder why she says she's doing fine.
It's so hard. And coming back to what you said earlier, the shame and the guilt, I would say shame and guilt are the two emotions that I work with the most in my work. And it doesn't matter if people are right at the beginning of their ex-Muslim journey, or if they've been ex-Muslim for years. Those two things, shame and guilt, they are always there to some extent. They might reduce in intensity, but I'm yet to meet anyone who's like, I don't feel any guilt about this. Like, I haven't spoken to anyone yet who's able to say that, myself included.
It's so deeply entrenched in us as well, right? Like, in so many different ways, whether we're in touch with our families or not. It could be the guilt of like not being around, and there's a reason of like, like for myself personally, like not being close to my family, and but also the shame of like, oh my God, because of me, my family's suffering, like quite literally, like with the community as well. And, they're still trying to hold the fort down by having a relationship with me. But it's so many different layers of it. So when you started your journey, like, when you were starting out with ExMuslims, how, I know those were not questions we were prepared for, but I was just thinking, how were you able to still, as a therapist, stay focused and centered? Because I'm sure things came up in therapy that you were just like, oh my God, this was also me. This is also me. This also happened to me. And this, there's so many relatable aspects. And like, I know before this call, I just told you about, a story. And I was like, how do you like not break down and not go, completely like heartbroken over these sessions?
Yeah, I think that the first thing that I'm always conscious of with clients is it's so important to have that separation, that whilst our stories are similar, there's similarities, they're also completely different as well. So, two people can go through the same experience but have different feelings about it because of our upbringing, childhood beliefs, etc. But the one interesting thing that I wasn't expecting when I started After Faith was how much it actually helped me with my healing journey, because I carry still, but at the time I carried a lot of guilt still. And it wasn't until I started speaking to other people who basically described what I've done right. And I just saw a tail, is that your dog or something? Yeah,
It's his toys. I always have to like entertain him.
Yeah, so it was when I started working with other people who would describe, I'm in a relationship now and I want to do this with my life, but I feel so bad. And I remember sitting there thinking, you're doing literally nothing wrong. And it was when I was saying that to them in my head, I was like, oh, but if they're not doing anything wrong, then that means I'm not doing anything wrong. And it's so interesting how it's much easier to see that when there is someone else in front of you. But I could not have said that to myself back then. I was so filled with guilt, basically. But yeah, through supporting other people who've been in similar scenarios, and they are just broken, they just kind of break down and they're made to feel like the worst person in the world. And you're like, well, okay, what have you done? And it's like, I decided to move out and get a job. And I'm like, that makes you a bad person. Like, this is mind blowing. Even as someone who's been in that culture, in that community, who's been through these things, to sort of see how much someone's made to feel bad for these basic human rights, just being able to live your life. So it might be things being in a relationship that their family don't approve of, or wanting to move out, live their life in whatever way. And it was through kind of supporting them that I kind of realized, actually, yeah, we're not doing anything wrong here. Like, this is actually crazy that we are made to feel this way. And I think that sort of helped me to understand. And it's as it always does, everything comes from childhood, right? Everything is the things that we believe now are the things that we were made to believe when we were very young. And when you kind of explore with ex-Muslims, kind of what was the message they were given, from a very young age, a lot of people are actually told, don't do anything to bring shame on the family, or, if they were seen speaking to a boy at school very innocently, as you do in the Western world, because we go to mixed schools here, it was like, why were you seen with that person? And, what
What
will
were you
people
talking
think?
about?
Yeah. These kind of really basic things, but you were kind of made to feel, even from a very young age, that you had done something so bad, and if it happened again, you'd be a terrible person and you'd be punished for that. And that stays with us, even as we get older. And logically, I think we can all sit here and say, well, of course we should be allowed to choose what we believe in, but the logic side doesn't add up to that child version of us who is like, oh no, I've done something wrong. And we see this, a lot of people describe that they feel confident and then they go back to see family and it's like, oh no, like I couldn't stand up for
Just breaks
myself.
you.
Yeah,
It's just, you're just like, even for me, it's just like I'm a different person.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
my accent changes, my behavior changes, my body's tightened up, I'm always alert. And I have a really sweet family for the most part. But even then I'm like, what's happening? Is everybody okay? Is everything fine? Like, is everything in place? And I realized for me, it also comes from childhood, where from a very young age, I was always the one who was like, and my sister was getting divorced, and my parents were like, "Oh, what will people say?" And I'm like, Dad, don't you want her to not be in an abusive relationship? Like, isn't her safety most important? And I'm like a 13, 14-year-old child saying this. And I'm like, it makes sense why, even now as an adult, I'm always like, is everybody okay? I'll solve your problems. I got you. Here, this. And obviously it makes sense why I run the charity as well. And I'm like, oh, I have this savior complex. And, same thing for me, like with the work, like, Faithless Hijabi before was a mental health program. We were working with emergency cases. And after my arrest in Tanzania, I was talking to my therapist and I was like, I feel ashamed. Like, I did something that happened to me. But no, I made this happen to me. And then she turned it around and she said, well, what if you were working on a case and they got arrested? Would you say the same thing? And I was like, no, of course not. And they're like, why are you holding yourself to another standard? And I'm like, because I'm a privileged brown woman, like my parents love me. And she's like, do you think that's privilege? And I was like, for many ex-Muslims, yes, but like at the same time, it's so basic. Like it's so basic to have that love that, I almost forgot that, like you said, people can go through the same thing and have different experiences. And I was going through this shame part or the guilt. Yeah, it was shame because we broke down the word. We're like, what does shame mean and what does guilt mean? And I was like, none of my family made me feel shameful. Maybe one of my sisters because she was shit. But like nobody else were just like, this is your fault. They were all like, this happened to you. Okay. And the good part was they were trying to downplay it and make it sound funny. And they didn't understand that I was still really like angry. But they were just like, oh, you went to jail. It's fine. Things happen. And I think it was their way of saying that it's not you. We understand a lot more now about ex-Muslim persecution as Muslims. So I can only imagine, like, for people who are, I guess, even with, the people you work with as well, like, UK or not, a lot of families that don't understand that are probably in a worse situation. Yeah. Right? Because their families are the root cause of them feeling the way they are. And like you said, it's childhood, right? You carried a lot from like that.
Yeah, it's so hard to unlearn all of that stuff. And like I said, I mean, do we ever really unlearn it? Probably not. We learn to cope with it better, and that's the aim. And I think just coming back to your question about kind of how I manage my feelings as a therapist with similarities, I think there was a period actually, probably about a year ago, where I thought about stopping after faith completely and not offering the support because I just felt like I'm not helping anyone. And the reason that I felt that way is when someone comes to me with something like OCD or phobia, there's a real tangible recovery. And the way that I've been trained is let's get people into recovery where they can say, this OCD is, it's improved and I don't do these things anymore. But I was working with ex-Muslims and I just kind of felt like this is so shit. It's so, I had these clients with just families who were really difficult, making them feel really guilty. They were in toxic environments, especially when you see people who still live at home and they have to hide for literally to be safe. And they're like, but I want to, but I'm feeling depressed. And I'm like, well, you are going to feel depressed. I would feel depressed if I lived in a house where I had to completely hide my personality. I would feel anxious. And it just felt like, I was like, what, is there really a recovery from this stuff? And honestly, I think the answer is no. There isn't recovery in the true sense. I think there's coping mechanisms, and that's something that I went back to my own therapy last year, and kind of that helped me realize it is just a cycle. Like you go through cycles. I go through cycles now where I feel okay and things are going well, and then it hits me again, and that's because it's a loss, right? So it's a loss of your old life. I describe it as my old life because it was so different to my life now, as I'm, sure for a lot of people that's the case, but also, the religious aspect, the community, for some people, families, and even for those who still have involvement with families, it's not the same family unit as it was. It's a loss of the family you once knew. It's new, it's completely different. It's sometimes superficial. We keep in touch, but we're not really family anymore. And I think that's what I kind of realized. And after I took some time, I thought, okay, maybe this is the best it's going to be. I think I'm in a place where things aren't great for me, but in terms of my ex-Muslim and my family journey, but it's the best it's going to be, and I can cope with it. And I know that there'll be times in future where it gets me really down again. But then I know that I have built a life where I have really supportive friends and got a good career, and I do things that are important to me. So I kind of have built a life outside of my old life now. And I think that's what I would say about the work that I do is, I think people, I had an email today saying, oh, I think you could help me kind of, the literally word it is, move into recovery. And this is someone who still lives at home in a really toxic household. And I was like, well, actually, you need to work on getting yourself out of that environment, because until you do that, you can come to all the therapy in the world, right? We could do therapy for years and years and years, but if you are going home to people who make you feel shitty about yourself, you will keep feeling shitty about yourself. So actually that's your priority. Your priority is, and that might be practical, it might be getting a job. And again, this is the postcode lottery, right? Because I appreciate this. You work with people all over. I predominantly work with people in Europe, in the UK, where it's more feasible for them to get a job, move out. I think that must be extremely hard for your work, where you work with people maybe who live in different countries, and there is no leaving their families.
I've had a girl from the Middle East who, I always do an intro call. Like, I'm not a therapist, so I always do an intro call, telling them this is how the program works. I'm not your therapist, but I just need to know enough so I can pair you with the therapist I know, because I know enough about the therapist who can help you. And, on the form, she's like, English. And I'm like, I talk to her and I'm like, how are you going to do this in English? Your English is not the best. And she's like, I have a dictionary. I'm going to look it up. And I was like, why don't you want to do it in Arabic? And she's like, because my family will hear it. If I do it in English, they're probably just going to think it's just some random person. And I'm like, okay, cool. How about I assign you an Arabic and English speaking therapist, so at least you can listen and you can express yourself. And when you're missing some English words, you have that opportunity. But then I also, like, the worst part is saying no to people, and not because of the money. I mean, yes, money is always tight with the charity, but it's no, because I'm like, you're in crisis. Like, if you keep canceling, it's one, a deficit for the charity and other people really need the support, but two, you're not in a good place. Like, if you're in, let's say countries like Pakistan, you live with your family, etc., and if you can't make time to have a call with me, like a 15-minute call, and I'm not even your therapist, I'm not even charging anyone anything, then I cannot also put my therapist at risk as well, because there is a safeguarding them as well. Like, if somebody was actually like, and some people's situations are very, very difficult, and it's very traumatic, and they can be very toxic as well towards their therapist as well. It's not, like you said, like, some therapists know when to go, like, okay, no, this is not working, so I need to stop. And those are like the difficult questions. And like you said, sometimes it's just like coping mechanisms, which is, I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I hope there's online channels do, or maybe the subreddit where you can pour out your feelings, but this is not something we can take on right now. And it's always so difficult every time, like, I have to say no. And then sometimes I have these calls and I'm just like taken back, and I'm like, what did I jump into? Like, what if I signed, like, even when I'm just doing like the introductory call, I'm like, oh my God, like, this is hard.
There's so much there, right?
Yeah, and it was also like, that's holding that, like for me also, it was like, my therapist helped me work through separate, because I would feel guilty, like I'm not doing enough, like I can't help everybody, I'm not doing enough, I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to do that. And I was going into burnout because like I have a full-time day job, I have freelancing outside that day job, and then I have all of this, and then the podcast, and I'm just like, and my therapist is like, you can't help anybody if you're not okay, and you can't carry that guilt, like you cannot, like it's okay to just help 3 people in a year and you're good and you're fine, and that's okay. And I just had to create that barrier almost through, like, people would tell me things, I would hear it, and I would not remember. I mean, obviously I'm not a therapist, but I would not remember it, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna send in your referral, and then I have to forget about it and lock it in a, compartment, and then I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go to sleep now. So I can only imagine, like, somebody who is ex-Muslim and you're taking all of this in, and I'm sure, like, you have your therapist as well and the training to like separate that. But I was curious to know if you found some patterns in your ex-Muslim sessions that were like, a lot of our journeys are similar, but I'm wondering if there were some like obvious patterns that occurred during your sessions with different people.
So I would say I always find this interesting. Most of the time when people come to see me, it's because they're in a relationship, a secret relationship with someone non-Muslim, and they're at the journey where they're like, I want to move my relationship forward. So sometimes they're already living with their partner and their family doesn't know. Sometimes they want to move in with their partner and they don't know how to go about that. And that's usually the point that people come to see me, because it's like, I think I need to tell my parents now. And that's the very clear goal of therapy. It's like, I need to tell my parents in some way about, sometimes people want to tell them everything. I want to tell them ex-Muslim. Sometimes people will be like, well, I don't need to tell them everything. I can say I'm still Muslim, but that I've got a non-Muslim partner. But that's usually the time that people will come for therapy. But in terms of, like Rosie mentioned, what stops people from doing that is, yeah, I mean, it's that guilt. It's like, oh, it's gonna completely break their hearts, and I'm going to ruin my family. So it's fear of hurting them. Sometimes it is fear of estrangement as well and losing family. But if I'm honest, the majority of the time this is going to kill my mum. This I hear this so much, right? She's not going to be able to survive. She's just going to die. She's going to have a heart attack. It's going to kill my parents. And just to say, in all the people that I've worked with, none of them have ever killed their parents. No one's ever died as a result of someone becoming an ex-Muslim. But it is something that I think we all think is going to happen, that, they're just not going to be able to deal with it. And yeah, so that's a big theme. So, the work that we do, and I think this is why it's so hard, is you are going to feel guilty. I can't take that away from you. I can't magically make you not feel the guilt. Actually, a lot of the time it's, if you want to do this, you need to acknowledge there is going to be pain on all parties, your parents, your family, and you're going to feel guilty, but you can get through it. And that's the bit, that's what the therapy focuses on. It's like, a big good first step is, who is your support network? Because you're going to need one. If you are planning on coming out to your family, you don't need a big support network, but you do need a support network. You need 1-2 people who are going to be there for you, because potentially you're going to be quite isolated when this happens. And I think another thing people often don't think about is, maybe to kind of the outside world, is they think, oh, your family's going to cut you off, you're going to end up estranged, which can happen. But there's also the other side where you might need to cut your family off. And I think people don't think about this when they come. And it's only when they tell their family, and it becomes very volatile and very emotionally abusive. I've seen people get hundreds of texts in a day from family members just full of abuse. And that people are never prepared for. They think it's going to be that they'll be cut off, maybe. But then they start thinking, do I need to be the one to cut myself off? Do I need to block my family? Which again makes them feel very guilty. But
Because you're the one doing the breaking up.
yeah, exactly. But like I said, how do you start to feel better when you've got someone constantly telling you that you're the worst person in the world and that you deserve pain and that you don't deserve to be happy? You know, that's going to make you feel bad. Hearing your mum or your dad or a sibling, whoever it is, tell you these things, it is going to make you feel a certain way, and you might need to distance yourself. And I think that's something that people need to be aware of, that yes, you might end up estranged from family, but it could be either one of your choices, and that's fine. You know, both parties have a right to say, we don't want you in our life anymore. So as much as we don't like to admit it, if our parents have a boundary, and this is something I've kind of had to learn myself, is, you know, if they have a boundary that you're not a Muslim and that's the only thing we're going to accept, I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to be okay with it. But if that's your boundary and you don't want me around, that's what I have to accept. So it works both ways, but equally we have a right to say, I don't deserve to be abused and manipulated and gaslit, and I can put a boundary in place and say, I'm not going to have anything to do with you anymore. So it needs to go both ways, and I think that's something else I would say people aren't prepared for when they come to see me, that, you know, I will suggest things if it gets very abusive and people are struggling. I will say, have you thought about limiting your contact?
So I have three things while
Sorry,
you
I
were
spoke.
talking.
I said a lot there.
I love it, because like for me personally, when I decided to do my first podcast, I blocked my family. Not because they were abusive. Like, yeah, there was like bits of guilt here and there. They couldn't understand. They thought it was a phase. But I blocked them because I didn't want other Muslims hurting them if they knew they were in touch with me. So I was like, this is for your safety and you will not understand it. And then my brother actually heard my first podcast. He's like, I understand why you had to leave. I understand that, you know, you can't stand the hate, the racism, the homophobia, etc. And that's how we actually reconnected with the rest of, like, you know, my family. Like, you know, we never had this ostracism kind of mindset. Maybe my dad a little, but he would do that if you didn't get 100 in exams, not the ostracism. It was just like disappointment. But the second part was, you know, the cutting your family out. So I don't agree with this post that I saw online from this therapist, who I really like, is a brown therapist, South African based. I really like her page. And, you know, she talked about Western therapy concepts. Maybe you saw that post, maybe you didn't, but I completely did not agree with it, because I've worked, you know, secondhand with like over 100 and something ex-Muslims, and I always get feedback from everybody, and whenever I can. And, you know, very rarely do I have, you know, maybe less than 3% stop therapy, or, you know, 5%, maybe. So everybody is like, I want more, or, so it's always been positive. So one of the things that she mentions is a Western therapist concept of cutting your parents out or setting boundaries doesn't always work, or like the individuality and putting your needs first, because as brown people, we're collective. Like, you know, we're a collective society. Like, that's how we're raised, you know. And I thought about it and I'm like, I think it's such, to me, like, I mean, I'm not a therapist, but to me, like, just seeing this person post this was so, I felt like it was kind of like blaming the Western therapist, but it was also kind of reinforcing the negativity that comes out of our cultures as well. And I don't think like cutting people off is a negative, like it can't, is a negative response. I mean, it really depends on the therapist, really. But it's also a way of kind of showing you that this is one of the Western ways that, you know, you can safeguard yourself, or like, you know, just a way you can safeguard yourself. So, you know, when you said that people are not prepared to, like, you know, cut their parents off, or like, you know, that thought, that post immediately struck me, because I was just like, I don't think that's a Western concept. Like, saying that it's a Western concept is the same thing as saying that, you know, Western women can wear what they want to, but Iranian women should do it differently. or like women of color should do it differently, instead of like, this is very individual and it's very like based on the circumstances, because toxic families are toxic families.
100%. It sounds like, I mean, I haven't seen that post, but it's to me, it sounds quite shaming to me of someone who had asserted those boundaries. And I think the important thing to remember about these therapists on social media, I know I'm a therapist also on social media, but some things are just opinions, and I think people put a lot of weight on posts, and this is something that I try and be very careful of. And like I said, even though I've been through the ex-Muslim journey, my journey is my own, and I would never put what I've done and be like, this is what you need to do by any means. Like, I chose to come out to my family, and I fully support people who are like, I don't ever want to tell, some people will say from day one, I don't ever want to tell my family. That's fine. I will help you based on your choice, because that post to me is someone who doesn't agree with cutting family out, and she's kind of putting that out in the world. And like I say, I'm not saying everyone should cut their family out, of course not, but what I'm saying is, if it's abusive, I will make the suggestion of, would it be healthy to have some space? And it's always each individual's decision what they do. But yeah, with brown therapists as well, Muslim or not, again, that shame is so deep rooted that they probably don't even know that they're putting it out there, right? To them, it's just the norm. And, this isn't how I've heard, I got that comment from one of my relatives early on of, how did you think you could do that? We don't do things like this. And it is seen as a collective. We all brown Muslim people do not do these things. We're not seen as individuals. And that's, if you're going to therapy, you need to be seen as an individual. You don't want anyone else's opinions or anything coming out. And yeah, that's one thing I would really say, be mindful of when people are finding a therapist, is that you are making your own choices, and they're aiding you and they're supporting you to figure out what your choices are, which is what that's the bulk of my work, is what do you think is best for you? Let's go with that. But yeah, that's a very unhelpful stance to say it's a Western.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I think she said, Western psychologists need to know this, and I get her point. I get it, right? But at the same time, I commented and I said, like, I am not a therapist. Like, I've had this feedback session, and every therapist I've spoken to, and they'll give me feedback, right? It's not just testimonials from people who've taken the program. It's testimonials from people like you who are therapists, because we want to improve the program, and we want to also learn from our therapists as well and get their feedback. And, almost every therapist has always made it very individual. And when they don't understand or are at risk, I'm their first point of contact. Like, it could be somebody in Saudi and they're like, what do I do here? And I commented and I said, I'm like, I feel like this is kind of reinforcing the negativity from our cultures by putting this as a Western concept. It has to be like an individual kind of thing. But actually, as you were talking, I was thinking about the first thing you said, that the guilt part of feeling the way you do, like, you've brought I'm going to kill my mum if I say this, I'm going to do, and I wanted to focus a little more on that, based on something we discussed earlier about, the childhood being raised this way, for you to feel that you're going to kill your mum, that you're causing your mum pain by choosing to love somebody or by choosing to not wear something. And I was hoping we could talk a bit more about like what that looks like as a child. So if we take any of your cases, for example, or I could come to you and I'm like, okay, well, if I tell my mum this, I'm going to be disappointing them. I'm going to be bringing shame on them. They're going to be very stressed about it. They're going to worry about this, and it will just break their hearts. Why do you think that we feel this way? And where from this childhood, I guess what I'm saying is, like, what part of our childhood contributes to us feeling this way? And it could be theories. It doesn't have to be like super researched, like professional PhD right now, but it could be theories.
Yeah. I do ask my clients that. I actually have asked a question, what makes you think they're going to die? Because you tell them this, and they will often say, because when I was younger and I did this bad thing, my mum basically either stopped eating for days because, you know, I've had someone say they had a boyfriend, for example. She found out and she just stopped eating for 2-3 days. She didn't get out of bed. So that's kind of a core memory that they have of they've done this thing when they were young and it led to their mum just shutting down and not being able to function. But I also think, you know, I'm Pakistani and there's a lot of drama involved, I would say, from from the older generation, you know, in terms of they would have seen their mum. It's always the mum for some reason, but, you know, like this person fainted, you know, this thing happened, I did something or my sibling did something and she just fainted to the floor, like she couldn't cope with it. I've had people say they've had to call an ambulance for their mum before when she found out this shocking news. So it's from real reactions that children see. You know, they see these things happen, or they see their parents arguing. This is very common, right, from a young age. And what are they arguing about? Something that you did. You know, it caused a conflict in their home. So you grow up thinking, right, if I don't play by the rules, is my dad going to hit my mum? Are they going to separate? You know, is mum going to be bedridden again, unable to eat for days? And, you know, I guess we always think that when people are particularly stressed, we think, oh, they're going to have a heart attack. But actually, you know, we have surgeons, and I say this to my clients all the time, we have surgeons who work in A&E performing, you know, we have neurosurgeons doing brain surgery. These are very stressful jobs, and these people don't drop dead as a result of the work that they're doing. So we can handle stress. And a lot of the time, you know, our parents, again, I'm sorry, I know I'm very UK based here, but they have moved here from a whole different country. They've had to learn to speak a new language. That was stressful. You know, if they can survive coming to a new country, starting from scratch, and in a country where they don't speak the language, they can handle it. But yeah, that's where it comes from. It's from things that we see. You know, we've actually witnessed people breaking down, people wailing and crying. And, you know, if you've ever been to a Pakistani funeral, I mean, these are some of my core memories. I'm like, come on now, like there's grief and then there's let's kind of show everyone how distressed we are. You know, there's drama. You don't see this in other cultures. People don't behave like.
I'm from a Shia family. We have Ashura. So,
okay.
So I know that. I'm like being forced to cry. And I'm like, but I don't feel it. Something's wrong with me. Like, I don't understand. Like, okay, I get a baby shouldn't have been killed, but why did they go to war? And, you know, I would, like, in my head, I was like, so yeah, we have Ashura. So I'm like, I always know, like, you know, the women who cry the loudest. And I'm like, where am I?
Yeah. But that's where we see it. You know, we see these reactions when we're younger. So, you know, it's usually the dad gets angry and shouts and the mum kind of cowers and cries and gets upset. And how do we feel? Oh, I'm responsible for making my mum cry. And we're told, look what you've done. Look at how your mum is. And again, this is
always the mother that gets blamed.
It is. Yeah.
So you didn't raise your kids right. It's your fault. So, you know, when I was arrested and, you know, my siblings were like, you know, with the police, like the whole thing that was like actually happening as the police were frantic about, you know, oh my God, she's a foreign citizen and we're fucked with somebody we don't know. And that's a whole different story. And my sister that I actually don't really talk to as much. And, you know, the first thing she told my dad was, this is your, or like my mom or my parents was like, this is your fault because you let her post things online. And I was like, oh, so I'm getting arrested over something that is not even my fault because they didn't even know my name. They literally, you know, arrested my brother and showed them my photo. They're like, we want her. So these people do not really know anything like about me because they're paid to do something. And then she says this, and then she says it to me. She's like, this is all because of your activism as I'm going to jail. And I just screamed at her. And I'm like, get out of here. And it was just so interesting how it was like, even for her to carry that on, that like, you have no individuality. It was because you were raised this way or because your mom let you. And my sister would use this manipulative tactics. And that's why I was like, look, I can't deal with you. And she would use this and, she'd go like, mom is hurting. She's crying every day when I just removed a hijab. And I'm like, mom can tell me this. I talk to her like once a week and she's never said anything. She'd actually people would tell her off, but she'd actually never come to me. And, my family was really good that way, or most of them were really good that way, that they'd get into fights on their own about me because people would complain about me and I would never hear of it until somehow months later, my other sister, I have so many sisters, my other sister just said something and I'm like, wait, what happened? When did that happen? Why would somebody talk about me? And I realized that they were actually being so brave for me. And that was so, and that's why, like, in my mind, I'm like, I'm still going to do me. But I am incredibly proud of that relationship that we were able to build where they're like, I get a lot of hate from my community, like so much hate following that, it's such a gossip community where if somebody is hateful, I'll take a screenshot. I'm like, you cannot be a bitch to me on private. I will post this up.
Mm-hmm.
And when I post this up, then it brings shame to the other person for being horrible to me.
Okay.
And then they'll like start calling my family. Then I tell her to take it down. And my sister's like, shouldn't have messaged her. It's your fault.
Yeah.
And my sister, and it was so beautiful that they were like, yeah. And I was like, oh, look at them, because my sisters actually, and they met my boyfriend like just for the first time in July, and they actually said if it wasn't for Zara, none of us would have stood up for ourselves, because she was the first one who stood up for herself. And then every time we would take shit, and I was like, oh wow, you guys never told me this.
That's incredible, though, and I think it's really great to hear that you've had that positive influence on the rest of your family as well, because that's how change happens, right? Change has to start somewhere, and someone has to go through the shit. So, you've been through a lot of shit, but, your family have now hopefully changed their mindset a little bit. And I guess the long-term aim is that filters out into the community, but I appreciate that we've got some way to go there.
Yeah, no, it is interesting because when we were talking about like it's the mother's fault, it's also like that generational trauma that a lot of us ex-Muslims are breaking in many ways, not just by leaving Islam. It could just be like by setting a boundary, because their parents never set a boundary, so they're like, what do you mean boundaries? I cook for you food, I cook food for you, you live in my house, what do you mean you're setting a boundary? So it's like a lot of these things that we're breaking that are so new. And I recently made a video on like, how do you have difficult conversations with your parents if they're not abusive? And I was like, sometimes it's okay not to have those conversations. Sometimes it's okay just to go like, hey, we don't agree, so let's not talk about it or listen to the other side. How have you found, like, when people come to you with, let's say it's a relationship advice, or like, how do I come out to my parents? And if the outcome is, not ostracism or like shunning, what are some of the tactics or some of the practical advice you would give to the ex-Muslims who do want to talk to their family or do want to come out, and how to build up that bravery to do that?
So I guess part of it is thinking about, you must feel safe to do this. So one of the things I always look at with people is, do you live with your family? And if you do you feel as though you will be safe to stay there after you tell them? And if the answer to that question is no, I wouldn't recommend coming out, basically. So usually when people have come out, when they've worked with me, they have been living outside of the family home. And they have varying relationships. So some have been really close to family. Some are like, I only really speak to them once a month anyway. So when I've supported people in the past, we have done things like, some people have actually sent a really long email to family members rather than seeing them face to face, which I found really interesting. So that wasn't my suggestion. That was what the individual that I was working with was like, I think an email would be best rather than seeing them face to face. And that worked quite well for them because it meant they could kind of give the message and not have to receive any response immediately. And that person, I'm thinking of someone in particular, had kind of worked up to a point where they had accepted it likely will lead to estrangement, that they likely will cut me out. But they were in a place where they were okay with that. Because like I said, a lot of the time people have got almost like a second family, right? Like they have a partner, they have their friends. So they're like, okay, I don't want to lose my family, but that's probably the most likely outcome here. So at least I've started building my new life, and that's what I'll continue to build. Not that that takes away from the pain at all, of course, and I would say that's quite typical of a lot of people in relationships that I've worked with, is that they will come to me and say, there's nothing I can do. If they choose to cut me out, they choose to cut me out, and I'll have to sort of learn to deal with that. So that's typical of a lot of people. Now, when people do get cut out, it's a lot more difficult. It's easy to say, I'll deal with it. When it happens, people have found that very difficult. And that's kind of led to them trying to make up and almost bargaining. It's very easy to get into the trap of bargaining of, well, yes, we'll do a nikah, they'll convert, we've had conversations around this before. And again, that's a very individual choice. Do you want your partner to convert? So there's so many conversations that go into this basically. But essentially, in terms of emotionally preparing for it, I always say there is no right time. You do just have to. If you've made a choice that you want to move forward, you are going to have to basically tell them. If that's what you've decided, that you have to tell them so you can get married or so you can have a child. What do? Do you delay things until it's too late, right? Like, especially with women, we have biological clocks. How long are you going to wait to have a baby? And, so it's kind of, you do get forced. I think people often will only say it when they feel forced into telling them because they want to move forward. So yeah, sometimes it will lead to estrangement. Other times, like I said, it's a lot of emotional abuse, manipulation. If you just do this, if you do that, you can come back, and etc. All these bargaining tools. We'll buy you a house, we'll do this, whatever, if you just leave this person. So there's all these different things that go into it. But yeah, honestly, I would say there is no amount of mental preparation you can do. I think there's the practical stuff of knowing where you'll be living, knowing who your support network is. Will work give you time off if you're too upset to go in, which often is the case. So it's kind of all that kind of thing. And then the rest of it is just getting through it, like with that life that you've started to build, remembering what's important to you, remembering, what do you want your life. I always say it's a very dramatic way of looking at it, but when you're on your deathbed and you're looking back at your life, do you want to say, oh, I'm really glad that I did exactly what my parents wanted me to do. I didn't achieve anything that I wanted, but I kept my parents happy. Or do you want to look back and say, I was really brave and I did this really scary thing, but it meant that I got to marry my partner, I went on to have kids or a house or a great career, I got to travel, all these things, obviously whatever's important to you. Because sadly, you can't do both. You can't keep your parents happy and do all of those things. So you do need to make a choice and accept that will be really hard to do. And kind of, that's what the coping strategies are in therapy. It's looking at what are the kind of self-care things you can do, who can you talk to, how do you limit emotional abuse, contact boundaries with family members, and there's so much to think about within that. Even for myself now, I mean, I've got obviously a open social media for my therapy work, and there's still some things that I'm very private about and I won't post on there, even though the damage is done. Things probably can't get much worse, but I'm like, there's very nosy people, right? So you go on.
Yeah. I was also going to say, I also think it's like the social media trend, be vulnerable, put yourself out there. And I'm like, yeah, I get that. But also, like, there's some things that are just not feasible. And there's some things you can't take back. And I'm not saying people shouldn't be themselves. They should be themselves.
Yeah,
But then I think it's also like with maturity, and as you get older, you realize, what do I want to put out there? You know, like what is the benefit? Like even when I put like, you know, my t-shirt Allah's gay, I know it's gonna piss off a lot of people. And, you know, I still do it. And then every time somebody asks me, why do you do that? Like it's so blasphemous. And I'm like, people are dying, you know? The fact that you're getting this reaction, ask yourself, is this worth getting angry over? Or is it worth that we are angry by the regimes that are killing people because they're upset about this? So what is more important? And, you know, I don't always get positive answers. But also like it was like one of those things that I had to like think so much about it. And I'm like, no, I'm gonna put this out there because I want to, because it's very important to me. And, you know, I had my dad sit me down and he's like, can you not post anything? Like, I understand you've left religion. I understand you want to focus on women's rights, you know, outside is like, you know, within Islam, outside Islam. Can you not blaspheme about Muhammad and Allah? And I'm like, Dad, my existence is blasphemous. You know, to some people that I exist is blasphemous.
Yeah.
And the fact that people, and like, you know, this was 2 days before Samuel Paty was killed. And I was like, you can be upset about it, and that's okay that you're upset. You know, I can be upset that the Quran says that I deserve half of what a man does. And rationally, you know, that doesn't make any sense. And I can still be upset about it. And I'm not out there telling, you know, like, killing people for it. And then this incident happens, and then the first question was like, oh, why did he have to provoke? And I'm like, did he provoke? And okay, let's say he did provoke. Was the answer death? And that was when it ticked, right? Like, I mean, they're not very like, you know, angry because they did ostracize me. So I know that they don't come from that background. So they're not very angry. And they're like, yeah, but he shouldn't have died. He could have been criticized. He could have been hated, maybe even fired, right? But they're like, yeah, but he shouldn't have died. And I was like, that's what I knew. And I'm like, see, this is the point, right? That when people do this, they're talking to you about, they're telling you that people like you should talk about, you should talk about like, you know, anti-fundamentalism. So whenever I have even Christians going like, oh, Christians don't kill gay people. And I'm like, have you been to Uganda? And I'm like, I am from the region. My family's East African. My aunts were expelled from Uganda during Idi Amin. So I know, you know, what happens to gay people. And the fact that you have to tell me is the problem, because I'm not the one doing it. You are the one who has to, like, you know, start talking to other Christians who do it. Or start talking to other, I'm not saying it's a duty of every Muslim, but I'm just telling you that, you know, your stories, or like, I'm not saying you should be an activist, but like your examples of tolerance, this is an example, like our relationship is an example of tolerance. We don't have to like what the other person says. I don't have to like that you say there is no God but Allah. Maybe I believe in a different God, and I could. But, you know, that's what, and that's when it started, like, kind of going, and then sometimes it's forgotten because, you know, they live in an environment where it's not Pakistan, but it's not the UK. So it is like that in-between kind of place where it's very community bound, so much so where, you know, sometimes you'd feel Pakistan is liberal in many ways, because we don't have women in our community, not at the time when I was there, like, who don't wear hijab.
Okay.
So that was like, you know, that was like one of the things. I'm not sure why I started talking about it, but this has been such a nice chat. I was actually going to ask you as like an ending. I wanted to hear one of like a success story, like a good outcome of a goal that you achieved with the ExMuslim. Because I think we're always in dire need of some of the success stories, be it that, you know, somebody was able to remove their hijab, or somebody was able to have that conversation and build up that resilience to even, like, you know, cut off their family and be okay with it.
I'm going to have to change some details just because of confidentiality, but I would say, yeah, what I would view as a success story, it was someone I was working with who I was very concerned about this person's safety, who their family wanted them to go abroad with them let's say it was Pakistan, I can't remember where I was actually, but let's say it was to a Muslim country, right? And we'd been having conversations and there was just alarm bells going in my head, and I was thinking, I don't think you're coming back from this plane journey. And that's really hard to deal with. It's not something I've dealt with a lot as a therapist. I don't think I've ever dealt with anything like that. And I was a bit taken aback. I was like, do I tell them? Because like I said, I would never as a therapist tell someone what to do unless I think it's literally a matter of life or death. And in this case, I did. And I had to say it really explicitly, you know, I don't think you should be going on this plane. I don't think that what they're saying to you is accurate. And I think if you go over there, you will not be coming back, basically. Long story short, thankfully, they ended up not getting on the plane, which turned out to be the right decision. Because this obviously, when I say I had alarm bells, this was in the context of their family. They went from being quite strict and unhappy with life choices to suddenly finding out that this person had a partner and being like, oh, that's totally fine, you know, we're fine with that. Why don't we all go on a family holiday? So you can see what I was thinking. I was like, I think a family holiday might be a forced marriage of some kind is what I'm thinking. Yeah, and I think that big shift in the family perspective is what set those alarm bells off for me. I was like, who goes from being really strict and we don't need to do this, we don't need to have a partner, to, yeah, so this person had obviously come out and said, look, I do have a partner who is not Muslim, who is this, that and the other. And yes, seemingly they seemed very supportive of this relationship. So yeah, they didn't get on the plane and things worsened after that. So the abuse got worse, the emotional abuse, luckily that there was no physical abuse in this case. And eventually, after a lot of sessions, the person made the decision to cut all ties, which was extremely difficult decision for this person for, I think, obvious reasons. Who wants to cut ties with their parents, right? They felt a big sense of the guilt, but tied into that responsibility of my parents are getting older and who's going to look after them and I need to be there for them. I haven't really done anything, you know, all these things people tell ourselves. And I was actually really proud of this person for acknowledging that I could keep in contact with them, but look at what it's doing to me, basically, you know, kind of having to lie and hide, can't kind of go and see them abroad because they were worried about their safety. So to me, and I know this might sound like a weird success story that I'm telling you, but I was just relieved for their safety because I had been really concerned about this one. And yeah, and you know, this is someone I finished with a while ago, and things aren't perfect. You know, obviously everyone misses family, but you know, they have a new life and they will build that moving forward. And I think sometimes if you want to build your new life, you do have to let go of your old life. Sometimes they can coexist, but sometimes they can't. Sometimes your old life will stop you from moving forward, which was the case for this person. They weren't going to be able to move forward with their partner and have children and have the life they wanted if their parents were there shaming them and making them feel guilty. So once they were able to let go of their parents, it meant they could start to move forward. And I think that's what life is about. I think it is important to, you know, we're not here for a long time. You know, things can change. And I think I know this from my work. And, you know, I have a colleague who's just been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And when you hear things like this, real stories, you think, you know, that could have, you know, that could be any of us pretending to be a Muslim and sort of trying to wait things out, hoping it will get better, only for life to end or to change in such a dramatic way. And you know, your options then get taken from you, basically. And I think it's really important to make choices whilst you can. And again, I think, I'm very lucky with living in the UK. I have choices that people don't have. And that's one thing I would kind of remind everyone of who lives in a Western country where there is safety and there is support, is, you know, not everyone is so lucky. And I think it's important we remember that, because it's very easy to get tied into the guilt and the shame. But at the same time, you know, change has to start somewhere. That breaking that generational curse has to start somewhere. and it's not going to happen in Pakistan and all these places,
No.
right? So we kind of have to start somewhere. So I think, for me, that was a really great story, because I was really pleased that that individual was able to sort of take charge and say, look, I've tried my best, I've done as much as I can, but now I have to live for me, because we all have to live for ourselves.
I think I'm going to have you again and talk more about the live for me part, and how we talk about that gap when we don't talk to our families, the gap that we always have, the hole in our hearts.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that just needs like a whole different session, right? Like talking about, somebody that raised me doesn't want to talk to me anymore, and I miss them, and I want to talk to them, but they've cut me off, or I've had to cut them off.
Yeah.
And I really want to do like if you're open to it, I think it would be really nice to talk about like, why do we have that gap? And then how do we, I guess, solve for it? There's other people's support, but also identifying, maybe patterns in, why we feel that need to be attached to our families and have that connection as well. And then how do we prioritize ourselves in different ways? But thank you so much for this. It was actually quite, I want to say fun, but it was actually really educating as well for me. It was so very, very educational for me. And it was really nice to dive into like the different topics that I would normally do when you hear ExMuslim journey, but also like from a psychologist's point of view as well.
Yeah. No, well, thank you for having me. It's always good to talk about these things and raise awareness, so hopefully will help someone understand a little bit better.
Yeah, I will link your page in the description as well. And of course, if you ever have anybody that needs our support, do refer them to Faithless Javi. Thank you so much, Aisha. I'm going to stop the recording, but please stay on.